Back, I'm going to go further into Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and the Angel Out Ahead, Chapter 7, which is called The Angelic Function of Beings. So I have to try to give some kind of context for this, which is going to be difficult. So there's a couple of things. I'll give pieces from Vervaeke and Schmachtenberger and then try and bridge through Corbin and Jung with maybe a little bit of how to get to the start of the chapter. So basically, we have this sort of diagnosis of meta-crisis and meaning crisis, and I'm dealing with what could the cultural response be. And it's sort of like, through Vervaeke, we have the sort of, ecology of practices with community practitioners with a viable worldview. What kinds of practices? Well, dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied practices. Okay, great. Well, what is the imaginal? What are imaginal practices, and how could they support us? That's a fair orienting question in this. There are a few others. Through Daniel, the idea would be, hey, because of the technology, because of the arms race dynamics, and because of the sort of information explosion that we're going through, we need not only better sort of collective sentence making, collective decision making, and also the idea is, hey, we have to sort of do something fundamentally different about the human culture thing. The bumper sticker would be sort of through E.O. Wilson. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, and so we need some sort of cultural awakening, cultural enlightenment, cultural renaissance, change basically in our culture that looks like both remembering the best of what human culture has come up with in the past and sort of fundamental innovations in social technologies. So that's the kind of sphere of response. The basic idea being humanity is probably on, I have this, yeah, I don't think that we can really survive unless we have that. And I think there are good reasons for thinking that. And even if someone were to disagree with that claim and say, hey, even if we don't have a cultural renaissance, we can still sort of trundle along and technology is going to save us and it's going to be fine. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's fine. I'm still most interested in cultural change, cultural innovation, toward what Vervaeke is called reverse engineering enlightenment. Anyway, so even if someone doesn't have a sort of meta-crisis oriented framework, I still think this is a meaningful direction to push in. Okay, that's fine. A couple of other pieces through Jordan Hall. We sort of have the example of the Civium project, the idea that many people are sort of coming to the realization that cities, because of the internet, cities are no longer the center of gravity for people's creative minds being in the one space. And so people over, a while are going to be basically moving back to sort of local tribal scale for their living environment. And, Vervaeke's prescriptions about, a wisdom school model, the ecology of practices that I mentioned, and also Daniel's prescriptions about so collective sense-making systems are going along with this deep sociological change, which is happening sort of underneath and at the same time. And that for me is something that's sort of most interesting in all this. It's like if someone sort of comes to me and says, "Hey, I'm experiencing all of these, meaning crisis and meta crisis related problems." What I would kind of say is, "Hey, well, can you get into a community with some other people? Are you actually living and communing with other people as part of your life in a stack that looks like sort of communion, community culture before civilization?" Then I think from that sociological context, a bunch of problems basically just sort of disappear, and we get new problems. And that it's from that context that I think this kind of work is going to become more relevant. Okay, if I pause from there, then what? Okay, well, there's a couple of other things. One of them is that the problem of evil is one of the biggest problems that we face. Jung said sort of we are the origin of all coming evil. So there's a question about human nature. Is it possible that we can relate more actively, more deliberately with our own wholeness, with the totality of who we are? And so this kind of framing is again is a sort of model of development. So basically when we're running new cultural systems, we basically don't have much in the way of aspirational development, like good models of what people can be aspiring to, how people can grow, and whether it's sort of ancient Greek models about becoming more virtuous, or different kinds of spiral dynamic models. I mean, there's a lot of these sort of things floating around. I just sort of happen to take from Jung and others to say, hey, a good place to start is to relate more sort of consciously with our own shadows, and toward wholeness. And one way of framing a model of aspirational development is through the process of individuation toward wholeness. That's one way of putting it. I then think that that can be applied in group process as a good framing for the collective intelligence stuff, facilitating the emergence of deeper kinds of awareness, more, I would say, collective forms of awareness, but not only collective. And so I think the Jungian stuff can be applied in groups helpfully. And then I would give a couple of other pieces. I think it's most helpful. The reason I say that stuff about Jung is not just because I happen to have drawn from Jung and I think it can be helpful alongside other, let's say more cog-sci sort of stuff from Vervaeke and others. But I think Corbin is most helpfully considered in the context of Jungian theory in some way. I feel that Jung is a helpful and grounding scientific voice because he's interested in weird stuff, right? He's interested in, he talks about imaginal practice through active imagination and work with the soul, for example, and gives analogies through alchemy and so on. But he's also trying to be grounded in science and the empirical work and work with people's shadows, people's limitations. And that sort of corrects for some stuff that I see in Corbin in a way that I find helpful. But then Corbin is going to be adding some stuff that obviously Jung is not. What else? I have to mention Heidegger a bit. Okay, well, how do I get to that? It's challenging. I think so. What I would say is, again, if I mention the making sense of sense making video with Schmachtenberger, Jamie Wheel, and Jordan Hall from 2021, it is definitely hard to listen to in places. But for me, the reason that that video is important is because it's the first time that I realized that there was a deep interconnection between states of sort of group awareness, like focusing or honing in on what's going on as it's going on, that there was a deep connection between that and the kind of world crisis sort of situation. And that when I'm talking about this kind of cultural response to, let's say, that world situation, what I understand is that cultural practice that can help us to focus in on what's going on as it's going on and to be more aware in groups, not just to train skills, is going to be, I would say, a critical part of how we need to respond. How else could I articulate that? Well, through the Islamic Sufism that Corbin is pushing, and through Heidegger, we get the sense that is news, I think, in some way, that it's possible to relate to being or to existence as a shorthand as a kind of imperative, the imperative to be. So this comes with a sort of implication that it's possible to be more in some way, which is a bit of a risky way of framing it because it's kind of like you don't kind of want to get attached to being more all the time. But the basic sense is that we can realize that it's possible to, in a way, intentionally become more aware, more conscious, and also to have greater sort of intensity of existence, which I would say would go along with more personhood. So we can actually become more of who we are. And in Heidegger, what I understand is that there's a kind of feedback relationship between presence and place, which I connect through sort of Pythagoras and Jung to the archetypes of 3 and 4, although I will try not to talk about that right now. Basically, what I'm saying is that, this basic model of getting into a community, gathering in place, and then focusing on our presence. And in a way, if we can sort of bootstrap that or ratchet that through intentional practice, that is not only homemaking, it not only creates dwelling, the sense of belonging, the sense of being at home, but it brings our existence into place. It actually brings more presence into place. And it's hard to talk about what I mean by that. Maybe I'll just sort of leave the Heideggerian stuff there. But then, okay, that's great, Sam, nice words, but what does that look like in practice? Well, again, through some of not only Heidegger, but then the Sufism that Corbin sort of appreciates. There's practices that involve sacred reading, prophetic philosophy toward revelation. So he has this, the notion through Suhrawardi and Avicenna of Tawil, which I'm probably still mispronouncing, but basically the idea of reading what's going on as a language, right? So there's a deep, in a way, it's a structural grammar. Sounds kind of Chomskyan to what's going on now. So there's a way that we can tune in to what's happening as sort of inherently prophetic. And I understand that properly to be a kind of imaginal practice. So Corbin is adding these flavors that come with more of a mythic or archetypal sense to them that we don't see in Heidegger. Okay, so that's all fine. So that leads me to a couple of sort of conclusions of all of that. And so if I sort of put all that together in ways that might seem counterintuitive or maybe not, part of what I understand is that unless we can learn to iteratively update our identities, our sense of who we are, then we're probably going to be caught out. So there's something that's been really limiting us about who we consider ourselves to be. And if we can, through imaginal practice and the ecology of practices and collective sense-making practices and everything that I was just talking about, if we can gain facility with iteratively updating our sense of who we are, then I think that can be deeply helpful. And I'm not talking about in like, because I mean, look, a lot of people are changing their identities a lot, right? And I'm sort of saying that there's maybe something to that that we haven't recognized. And if we can sort of practice taking up different identities and then taking them off again and not being so invested in one of them, but learning to participate. Again, this is sort of Vervaekean language to practice perspective taking and practice participating in different ways in group contexts. Then I think that kind of work with the right intention can facilitate deep transformation. Not, and I don't just mean in our surface level identity, I mean in the guts of who we are. And I think of that as sort of inherently involving, like necessarily involving mythic work, archetypal work that a lot of which we've forgotten. Okay, what else do I need to add? Yeah, so through Heidegger, I understand that, and Corbin as well, that our sense of time and space and place, but just time for the moment, has been really limiting us. So I understand that we need to work out how to safely transform ourselves, and that because a lot of people would say, "Oh, that's very risky what you're talking about, and it's better not to push in that direction." And for me, there's a kind of situational assessment which says we need to learn how to do this, and that's maybe going to involve, you got to break some eggs to make an omelet kind of thing. But it seems to me something that we really need. And I think if one were to listen to what I'm saying and what other people who talk about, for example, transformative experience, gnosis, um, what we're saying, is that there's a way to do that that involves strong structuring around it, that involves, like I've said, community in place, an ecology of practices, community of practitioners, a viable worldview, and within all of that. And again, if you look to indigenous societies, that's how they do it as well. It's not just the spiritual marketplace that we see in the modern world, where it's just narcissism and people sort of adding experiences on like baubles on a Christmas tree. Like, oh, did you take this? Did you take this? That's not what I'm talking about. So with those, in a way, guardrails or caveats in place, that I'm talking about something that's quite specific, that has a very specific context for its utility, then I think it's reasonable and situationally appropriate to notice that unless I don't have a lot of hope in a way if we don't work out how to transform ourselves deeply and ongoingly. And that can look like, working out how to do that can look like a recovery of a lot of sort of the foundational elements of culture that we've lost, circa several million years, but also innovations. Okay, now specifically our relationship with time. I understand through Heidegger and Corbin that our particular relationship with time, that we're related to, the past, present, and future, that this is not only one of the sort of underlying metaphysical axioms that is sort of accidentally leading to a lot of nihilism, but that it's also, in a way, foreclosing or precluding our capacity for transformation. And that if we were to learn through imaginal practice to relate to time differently, so to notice, for example, that the past, qua past, so the past as the past, has a certain character and can be related to as that, and the future the same, then there's a way of sort of stepping out of that linearity and being able to step into it again. I'm not talking about leaving it behind, but being able to cultivate a relationship to what I might call eternity. And so to me, I've understood now that there's a tight relationship between the cultivation of virtue, archetypal forces and their presence, and a sense of eternity. So it's the way that sort of every situation is archetypal. Every situation has a mythic undertone that we don't notice. And I think for me, when I understood that time itself was sort of something that could be leveraged and that we could get a different sense for rather than sort of anticipating what is to come and looking back with nostalgia or regret. There's a way of understanding time in a different way, appreciating it differently, such as to be more here. And that unlocks something. It unlocks a certain focus, it unlocks a certain concentration on the moment, on what's happening as it's happening, that I think affords transformation. Okay, well, that will have to do. I know that was already a lot. But so from there, I mean, and so the high watermark in this series is probably coming in the last two episodes here, in which I really started to understand all that. And I've tried to condense it just here. And now what I have to do is try and go on into Corbin. And so obviously for Corbin, this is through the sort of building interiority, through cultivating a relationship between what he talks about as the sort of lower and higher aspects of the soul, or the soul and the divine double, considered differently. The divine double being the Socratic daimonion, or Vervaeke's sacred second self. And this is sort of, how is that relevant? Um, it's a little tricky to define that just off the cuff. I would say that, yeah, part of this cultural shift is toward educating people, including myself. I mean, this is something that we all have to do, right? To develop a much deeper sense of interiority than than we've really known. The idea being that we've sort of fundamentally forgotten who we are, and we don't know that in a way. We have an inkling of that. And so I think this Corbin stuff and Jung stuff about soul work and reensoulment, and whether we conceive of it as a relationship with a divine double or all the other aspects of, archetypal work, the stuff about individuation, this is all for me going along with developing deeper and more complex and more nuanced interiority, and wholeness and wisdom, I would say. And Corbin's stuff about personification, and what he talks about as angels, but what I understand as divine doubles, can really go along with that. And another way to talk about angels is sort of in the context of parts work. So if we relate to everything in their way of being parts, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? It kind of looks like animism, but it's not exactly animism. I would probably mention McGilchrist. So we're sort of in a cultural way, we're sort of trying to down-regulate the tyranny of the left hemisphere and upregulate a bit more of the sense of the right hemispheric way of looking at things, which involves looking at things in their quality of being alive, quality of being living. And so the idea would be to, instead of sort of objectifying the world so much, which involves like exploitation and like that, or leads to that very easily, the idea would be to cultivate the capacity through imaginal practice and the rest of this practice, rather than just to focus on our interiority, can we actually take the sense of the right hemisphere and apply it to the world in such a way that we can recognize that things actually have a living or ensouled aspect or guise. And that ties in a lot of Heidegger, a lot of Hillman and Corbin, so that it's not just about inner development, but it's about relationality, it's about the between space, or the we sense, the Geist, and it's about the work of reensoulment and reensoulment of the world, which is just one way of talking about it that I think, understood in this light, we can see to be profoundly valuable and needed, even if it makes us feel uncomfortable at a point when we're still unfamiliar with it. Okay, so from there, I'm now going to go back into the text, and that is going to, well, it's probably going to be difficult to bridge. So basically, again, so one of the framings through McGilchrist is that we've been sort of fundamentally cut off, disconnected from not only self, but also from the other, from nature, and from the sacred. And so one of the questions sort of running through this has been, hey, what about nature? Because Corbin stuff can be quite, in a way, psycho-spiritual. It can sort of be about going up and going into the interior. And the idea through the sort of Islamic Sufism, as I'm understanding it, is that no, it's through the exoteric, it's through the appearances, it's through group practice, right, that we unlock in a way or cultivate access to the esoteric, to gnosis, to transformation. And so there's a way that this imaginal stuff, even if it kind of seems out there, right? But there's a way that it can perfectly overlay our relationship with nature and with things. One of the books I'm looking at over there is Stephen Harold Booner, Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm, just as an example. Okay, so that's what allows me to bridge into some of the stuff about nature that is considered here. And I consider saying all that to be kind of necessary to start with this stuff. And it's even then, it's really difficult to bridge back into because Corbin wants to talk about Proclus, Ibn Arabi, a lot of stuff, a theosophy of nature. And this is through Tom Cheetham again. So with more that is, let's say, I mean, how did I do with the introduction? Was that clear? Did anyone follow that? Not sure if anyone else will ever watch this sort of thing. So if you have questions at this point about why this stuff is interesting or helpful, I mean, Vervaeke has articulated some stuff about why imaginal practice is relevant and helpful. And I think through Jung, we can also understand that in other ways from other perspectives. So to me, it seems quite obvious through the McGilchrist stuff as well. But still trying to translate Corbin into someone who, not just literally translating him, but actually trying to understand the relevance of Corbin is a battle, but it's very rewarding. It has been so far. The evidence being found in the last video, I would say. So let's see what Cheetham and Corbin have to bring this time. It's from page 184 in, again, Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin and the Angel Out Ahead. Chapter 7, The Angelic Function of Beings, Section 1, Idols and Icons. And again, what I'm going to be doing is sort of going through line by line or so and trying to bridge what is being said into more or less the context that I just gave. But it might be difficult. Let's see how I do. Cheetham states, Corbin held in high regard a figure nearly forgotten in Western philosophy, except among specialists, the Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus, born in Constantinople in 412 CE, had an enormous influence on Platonist thought in both East and West. Nicholas of Cusa and Hegel may be counted among his admirers. In his commentary on Plato's Parmenides, he discusses the symbolic meaning of the dramatic setting of that dialogue. Okay, so to me, this is immediately stuff about perspectival knowing and participatory knowing. Through Vervaeke, it's about the place, it's about the context, right? So for me, this through Pythagoras, this will be associated with the archetype of the number 4. It's about presence in place, or the perspective that we take into what we participate in, the environment that we're participating in a way, although environment is the wrong word. Corbin condenses this as follows. This is about the symbolic meaning of the dramatic setting of Plato's Parmenides. Quote, on the one hand, there are philosophers of the school of Ionia. They have studied every aspect of nature, deified, but they have scarcely given thought to spiritual matters. And there are, on the other hand, philosophers of the Italian school, represented above all by Parmenides and Zeno. These are exclusively concerned with things of the intelligible order. So basically, there's a spirit and nature split between these two schools, roughly. And then he says, between the two is the Attic school, which holds a middle position. Because under the stimulus of Socrates and Plato, a synthesis has been made between the findings of the other two schools, by whose mediation awakened souls ascend from the world of nature to that of the nous, intellect. Okay, so there's a couple of things there. Already, this is not merely a Hegelian thing to say. There's something about the between space, for example, in Martin Buber, right? Between man and man, or man and the between, so on. In Christianity, it's the Holy Ghost. It's the third term. In Hegel, it's the synthesis, but there's many other versions of this, right? I would say, in some ways, an increasingly, I don't know, increasing recognition or focus on that which is between being regarded as something of profound significance and importance. So this would come along with the discussion about the we space, the Geist, the second person perspective in Vervaeke, or it's James Fuller's relational ontology, the primacy of the relationality in some way. Again, that we see through Corbin, and the reason that Corbin finds something like this to be interesting is because it knits back together the sort of spiritual and nature stuff in a way that he feels allows ascension. And again, Corbin is sort of biased towards ascension rather than descent, which is why Jung is helpful in addition. Is there anything else with that? Yeah, I would say just briefly that this third, this synthesis that they're talking about, this middle position, is metaphorical. And in a way, what that's concealing is in Jung, the relationship between the archetypes of 3 and 4. So in alchemy, the problem of 3 and 4 is something that's quite old, and I won't talk about it here, but just to say, when we talk about this middle position, in terms of Jung and Pythagoras, it's the problem of 3 and 4, which is just another way, I think, of talking about the Heidegger stuff about presence in place and that generating that feedback loop. It's the same thing. Okay, Corbin continues. These Ionians, which were the first who studied nature a lot, are types of those souls who have descended into this world, who are really in need of the aid of the daemons. So again, Corbin conceives of the daemons or angels as these sort of, in a way, celestial aspects of the soul, which are designed to restore our sense of verticality in being, so that we have a relationship to, in a way, knitting ourselves back together and orienting to what is high. So it's a kind of inner dialectic that is about verticality and interiority that he feels is compensating for our deep involvement in the world. Again, these Ionians are types of those souls who have descended into this world, who are really in need of the aid of the daemon. This is why they abandon their house, the body. They emigrate to Athens. They set out on the way from ignorance to knowledge, from agnosis to gnosis. Okay, just pausing. That was something really interesting that he just said in passing. The implication is that the house is like the body, is the place of belonging, the site of being at home, right? The place of dwelling. Well, it seems like there is a connection, right, between our disconnection from that which is higher and our tendency to travel or to emigrate. So what he's saying is that we are obviously spiritually hungry. These kinds of people, we've gotten sort of stuck in the world in a certain way, stuck in orientation to nature. We don't have that verticality. And he's saying that this leads us to the loss of home, to emigration, to domicide in Vervaeke's terms. That we lose a connection to our house, the body. Well, that's what we abandon their house, the body, searching for something that we don't have. It's counterintuitive because you might expect that people who are really immersed in nature might be more connected to the body. But the idea is that we're actually spiritually hungry and so become disconnected from probably that which is in pain, I would suggest, as a result of that disconnection. Corbin continues, they, the Ionians, they set out on the way from ignorance to knowledge, from agnosis to gnosis. Again, so restoration toward gnosis. They come for the goddess whose sacred peplum is carried in the theoria or procession of the Panenea. Panathenea. It's Panathenea. They come for the goddess whose sacred peplum is carried in the theoria or procession of the Panathenea in celebration of the victory over the Titans who unloose chaos. Okay, I'm not going to get stuck on that. We're going to move on. He continues, the aim of the Parmenides is precisely to unite everything to the one and to demonstrate how all things proceed from the one. To come to Athens is for them to know that it is within the soul that the battle of the giants takes place, in which Athena is victorious. Athens is an emblematic city. Yeah, okay, so basically the implication is that the whole point of the Parmenides and the schools through Socrates and Plato is that we understand the significance of the one from which things emanate and to which we ascend, and that understanding this is to know that there is a certain sort of battle going on, which they think about as a spiritual war, essentially, and that that's actually taking place within our own soul. So the idea would be that we've actually really gotten cut off when we've lost our access to gnosis, to that which is most high, to the one, or to a proper path of spiritual development that we have come to forget or not notice that there is a great struggle going on within our own souls. One aspect of that, it would seem, would be the sort of burgeoning or otherwise foundering relationship between higher and lower aspects of the soul that we see through Corbin. Otherwise languaged as the human soul and the divine double sort of coming into amnesis as one being. And otherwise, there were also questions that he was asking throughout about sort of where we devote our souls, because we don't have places to go to, and that's kind of the whole point. We don't have, should we devote our souls to the church, to this, where can we go in order to foster our own souls? We don't have anywhere, and that's the whole problem. That's why, again, there's such a focus on place and belonging and home, because we need those centers before we can really get this kind of development off the ground. Cheetham continues, the battle takes place in the soul, and it is a battle for the soul as the necessary intermediary, without which nothing coheres and there is chaos. Okay, so there's a couple of things there. The idea being that there's a one way of conceiving about the inner chaos that we experience at this time and for a while is as a battle for the soul. It's a bit of a sort of classical or mythical way of putting it, but I think there's definitely validity to looking at it that way. And the idea being that there are different forces that are contending for, in a way, the loyalty of the soul. So the idea being that the soul, the human soul, let's say, which Corbin might call the lower aspect of the soul, it kind of it has this capacity to form relationships with different, either, different people, but also different, in a way, spiritual forces, different, you could say angels, but it's like, it's so difficult to grok what that really means. The idea being our soul is sort of inevitably devoted somewhere, and unless we're mindful about that, then it can be oriented towards forces which are very destructive. That, like, so one way, if we think about that, then this is a sort of I guess it's a mythic or archetypal way of talking about issues in our development. So, like, if we're suffering from addiction or all the problems that people are running into, are basically their soul is sort of loyal to or tied into forces which are profoundly harmful rather than forces that are supportive of their growth. Okay, so furthermore, we had the idea that the soul is a kind of necessary intermediary. So if we're wanting to, knit these different aspects of being back together, again, we've talked about soul work and imaginal work in the context of rebinding subject and object, knower and known, and also abstract and sensory, or like the intellect and the concrete material world. And the soul can be conceived of as a kind of intermediary between all of that. And so its restoration and its health is critical in some way to that kind of coherence of the world. That I mean, to anyone just discovering this, that might be like, how why did Sam just jump off the deep end? And I have to say that in the context of the rest of this is all just another language of talking about the same thing, and all seems quite reasonable to me. Another way to put it would be that the soul is in a way a site of the synthesis, that there are these oppositionalities, and the soul is in some way the place or the location internally and externally where that those relationships can be healed or cohered into unity or synthesis. Then Cheetham says, and more than the individual soul is at stake. Quote, our Western philosophy has been the theatre of what we may call the battle for the soul of the world. Okay, this is in some ways, an overwrought way of putting it, but I get what he means. Again, that's John, but it's like the point is that when we talk about the soul, even if we're sort of happy to start doing that, and I guess I have to sort of say what do I mean by that? To me, it's sort of like when we can practice perspective taking and sort of stepping out of um, ideology and healing some of the trauma that we're carrying, then we sort of unlock more individuality, more uniqueness, more vitality, um, more of who we are toward wholeness, toward totality. And I think of that along the lines of the development of the soul. I think all I mean by the soul is not necessarily a figure, although it can be conceived that way, but roughly who we are. So soul, anima, animation, aliveness. And then we have the further idea that the soul, if we conceive of it like that, is not just something that belongs to us in a way. It's something that is actually between ourselves and the world. So it has one way of understanding it would be that the soul has qualities that associate it with the between space, with the third that we've been talking about. And that means that as soon as we define, if we say, for example, what that means, what that implies is that the soul is something that participates in all dualities in some way. So, for example, one of them being individual and collective, just as one example. So the idea would be the soul, qua soul, the soul properly understood, we can understand to naturally participate in both individual and collective, I don't know, spheres or worlds. Anyway, the basic idea is that there are collective dimensions to the soul that we have been just as blind to as the individual dimensions of the soul. And one way of talking about that is the relationship between anima and anima mundi, soul and soul of the world. Yep. So if a brief sort of gloss on that would be that Corbin is sort of talking, and Jung sort of talking about this development of the soul stuff that we can understand to be important. And some verticality on that is that there's a relationship between what we call sort of the human soul or the lower aspect of the soul and Corbin's divine double. And that's the sort of vertical, but then there's also a horizontal relationship in some ways between the soul and the soul of the world. So there's a relationship between individual and collective sort of dimensions to the soul. Okay, now Corbin continues. It's actually Cheetham, and Cheetham says, again, that our Western philosophy has been the theatre of what we may call the battle for the soul of the world. Quote, this soul of the world is the divine presence, capitalized, the dwelling, wisdom itself as Sophia, which has its place only in the world of the soul, the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. Okay, so there's a couple of things there. again, it's already a lot, right? So basically, there's a connection between sort of cultivating the development or consciousness of the soul and soul of the world, and cultivating presence. Again, that's a sort of Heideggerian, but there's also it's a sacred or divine presence. So it has a yeah, you could say a spiritual religious overtone. Heidegger is very reluctant to talk in terms of the sacred, but here, if the soul of the world is the divine presence, this is not at all reluctant to call that presence divine. We also have that there's a relationship between that and dwelling, which again is Heideggerian. So there's a relationship between presence in place and this cultivation of the soul stuff. So I would understand that if we can focus on soul development in this way, both the vertical interiority of it and the sort of horizontal collectivity of it, that we're also unlocking this feedback loop between presence in place, and that enables the sense of dwelling, the sense of belonging, the sense of being at home. We also have that's a key component of the development of wisdom, and that here it's simply identified. It's what it says is this soul of the world is the divine presence, the dwelling, wisdom itself, as Sophia, which has its place only in the world of the soul, the imaginal world. Okay, again, there's a lot more, even in that just that one sentence, right? So the idea is that not only could we cultivate wisdom individually, but we could actually cultivate a home, meaning a collective dwelling place for in a way the for wisdom to be there. So the idea is that there are aspects of wisdom that are inherently collective in nature. That what else can I say about that? I mean, it's kind of like it's very tricky to talk about. So not only is the soul of the world connected to wisdom, identified with wisdom, in fact, with the spirit of Sophia, and also with dwelling itself. And so I would talk about a developmental feedback loop in individual and collective consciousness, involving but not limited to soul work, that can facilitate the sort of emergence and emanation of our consciousness of and as the soul and soul of the world, that can facilitate the development of our consciousness of quote unquote divine presence, of the sense of dwelling in place, and of wisdom. And that all of that goes together. And the further idea is that wisdom has its place only in the world of the soul, only in the imaginal world. So the understanding here would be that, at the very least, that imaginal practice is crucial for all of what was just said. And through Corbin, sort of practice with the imaginal world is the same as practice with the soul, in a sense. Okay. Wow. So already that's like a heap, right? Just in one page. Cheetham continues to say, quote, what we find instead is in the modern understanding of the world is the analog in nature of the absurd husk of the book. Okay, so he's talking about the way that the Quran came to be interpreted very literally, in a sort of objectifying way. So there's a way that as we sort of lost access to the world of the imaginal, there's been a sort of descent process. We've sort of fallen down further. We've lost the imaginal. We've lost the symbolic. We've lost the esoteric. And Corbin sees this as a great loss, a great tragedy. And basically, what that's resulted in is regarding things like sacred texts literally rather than symbolically. So we've lost the practices that he's talking about of sacred reading and prophetic philosophy and what he was calling tawil. So there's a deep connection for Corbin between this sacred reading and the process of ascension, or which is also otherwise known as the soul work or imaginal practice that we've been talking about. And so when he calls the book, meaning the Quran, has become a kind of absurd husk, that's very resonant. And so we see the same thing in nature. Basically, nature is read as something to be used and exploited rather than as soul of the world. Although, again, I would not want to equate the soul of the world with nature. Yeah, he says that this is nature as a merely literal and historical artifact, just as the letter of the revealed text must be freed from the death of dogmatic literalisms. So must the text of nature. So there's a way that he feels that these profound religious texts, like the book, like the Quran, they have to be freed from dogma and from literalism and restored into a more imaginal understanding. And in the same way, he thinks that the text of nature has to be treated similarly. Cheetham continues, the philosophy of nature described by Corbin exhibits none of the dualism or materialism characteristic of science in the West. Nature can only be understood in the context of creation as a whole. Nature can only be understood in the context of creation as a whole. Okay, so basically we would want to try to work out how to retain our access to science and scientific practice and account for some of what he feels are the dualisms and materialisms that result. So we're not wanting to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We're wanting to preserve scientific practice while also resolving dualisms that we find and our preference for materialism, obviously. And people like Vervaeke are very helpful in that. So there's a basic need to restore our sense for the whole, right? The commons or the one, all being treated sort of synonymously in a way. And there's a way that it's only from that point of view, it's only from the understanding or the knowledge of nature, of the whole, that we can appreciate nature, which makes perfect sense to me. Cheetham says, we are microcosms of this divine creation. Yeah, okay, so we basically get, again, a kind of feedback loop in our sort of appreciation of who we are and who the world is and what nature is. So that sort of understanding of microcosm and macrocosm goes along with all of this, apparently, which is just a sort of mythological way of talking about one of the aspects here, I would say. And he says, he quotes from Nasser, who's another author on these topics, and he says, Nasser says of this cosmology, quote, at every moment, the universe is absorbed in the divine center and manifested anew in a rhythm of contraction and expansion, which the rhythm of human breathing resembles. Okay, I like that. As a breathwork facilitator, I like the idea that breathing and this sort of oscillating systole and diastole through Goethe that we see in the breath resonates with the structure of the universe in some way. That would also go along with what John has been saying about the sort of dialectical or dialogical mm, structure of reality in some ways. So in a way, it's the breath as ontology. It's the breath as metaphysical axiom. Cheetham continues. We've already seen in the gnoseology that regards true knowledge as illumination from the active intellect that epistemology and ontology are inseparable. The seamless passage from above to below and back again is not restricted to the human intellect. All the cosmos participates in this movement. All the cosmos participates in this movement. An adequate philosophy of nature is based upon sympathy, love, and beauty. Okay, so there's obviously still a lot in there. I won't get too hung up on it because I think it's not that central. There's a way that, again, he's sort of talking about the way that we know what is true, the way that we come to know goes along with the, I would say, intentional practices and processes that we've been describing. And that there's a way of, when we sort of investigate in that way, when things develop in that way, that we also get closer to reality. We also come to know more of what is true, what is real, what is the case. And in that way, epistemology and ontology in a way converge. They're not separable. Going along deeply with gnosis. And again, this sort of breathing anagogic process is deeply involved in that. That's the same thing, essentially. And that, yeah, that allows for a kind of a quality of resonance between microcosm and macrocosm in which the whole cosmos in a way can participate. It should come to be more obvious what that means at a later date, I would say. I think we can generate a sense for that. And so this is what he conceives as kind of a prerequisite for an adequate philosophy of nature, which looks very different than the philosophy of nature that we see, what he would feel is in Christianity or in science. And he feels that this ought to be based on sympathy, love, and beauty, which is fine. I'll just sort of leave that there and say there might be other stuff as well. But wow, it's quite, again, far out. Okay, so basically what I have to do from here is speed up. So that was about everything so far has been about 2 pages in in this chapter, and I've got about 30 pages to go in 2 days or something. Let's see if I can do it. But basically, I'm going to be going faster and drawing down less. Cheetham states, Corbin draws on Proclus again in passages where he describes the movement of the flower, the heliotrope, as it keeps its face turned toward the sun. Proclus writes, quote, For in truth, each thing prays according to the rank it occupies in nature, and sings the praise of the leader of the divine series to which it belongs, and sings the praise of the leader of the divine series to which it belongs. A spiritual or rational or physical or sensuous praise, for the heliotrope produces a hymn to its king, such as it is within the power of a plant to sing. Wow, that's quite cool. So that's very suggestive. So what is in there? So the idea that everything prays, and there's a way that everything strives towards its ideal form, which in a way resonates with the one. So I would say there's a deep tie there between evolution, resonance, and aspiration. Also, the idea of there are multiple paths towards, in a way, the same end, based on one's nature or one's type, could say. And also life, in a way, like the proper form of life as hymnal. Which would go along with a sort of prophecy, song, language as the mythopoesis as a deep structure of being. Quote, Proclus saw clearly the essential community between visible and invisible things. Okay, so this is going to be, I would say, a struggle, but because we don't really like that language. But I would just say that for me, a huge part of this kind of process that we've been talking about involves knitting together or weaving together different pairs of opposites, one of which we can definitely understand to be visible and invisible. Definitely, we can understand that there's a lot that is very real and sort of true without being visible, obviously. Whether we understand that, whether we understand such things as angels or not, that is clearly the case. Corbin writes, This common essence is the perception of a sympathy, of a reciprocal and simultaneous attraction, between the manifest being and his celestial prince. But taken as a phenomenon of sympathy, this tropism in the plant is at once action and passion. Its action is perceived as the action of the angel, whose name for that very reason it bears. And this passion is disclosed in a prayer, which is the act of this passion through which the invisible angel draws the flower toward him. But since sympathy here is also a condition and mode of perception, we must also speak of the poetic or cognitive function of sympathy. Okay, so basically what's being talked about is, yeah, the essential community between visible and invisible things. And so this kind of dialogical feedback loop, this reciprocity between one and the other is conceived of in different ways. In relation to one's own angel, this is sort of conceived of as in relation to active and passive, upper and lower is one way of putting it. But then here, this kind of thing is sort of applied to plants or all life forms, could say. And that's talked about as sympathy and as something that can be perceived and associated with both action and passion. Again, the imperative to be. And that this is something that can, again, that can be perceived and that we can sort of learn how to perceive. So, yeah, sympathy as a condition and mode of perception. So it's again something to participate in. It's a certain mode of being present. So I would say the imaginal practice deeply involves, well, part of what it involves is recognizing this at the idea being that this is actually something that's already going on that we are ignorant of. So the idea being a recognition of nature, recognition of what's going on in nature, development of wisdom, and imaginal practice, as well as aspirational development, I would say, are all going together, which is actually quite profound. So Proclus, okay, well, let's continue with what Cheetham says, which is the cognitive function of sympathy is necessary for the elevation of the soul to a mode of being that transcends the literalisms and dogmas in which we so easily become trapped and entangled. Okay, so this is the idea of sort of sympathy or correspondence, sympathy with all things is again a sort of it's a noetic quality, it's a quality of perception. It's a way of being present, a mode of the soul. And just the reason I stop is I'm looking at a huge wasp outside my window. And to me, ever since so July, the wasp has become a symbol of the Great Mother, which is like quite synchronistic. But anyway, I'll just continue. So the idea is that there could be an explicit and intentional way of developing the cognitive function of sympathy, which is being talked about in this way. And it's a way of, I would talk about participating in the in this kind of reciprocity. But it's like it's a little tricky to talk about because there's so many different pairs of opposites that you have to sort of specify, yes, but participating in which ones? So in this context, like how would I draw this down? What I would talk about is applying group practice, particularly dialogical forms of group practice, but also imaginal, to plants, to living forms. So the idea would be to do circling, but about a tree, for example. What do I mean by that? It's like putting a living form in the center and talking about its the qualities of its growth and development. So getting into deeper sympathy with other forms of life. So cultivating the capacity to recognize the essential community between not only visible and invisible things, but all of life. And so the idea would be that through intentional practice, this is a way of perceiving nature, a way of cultivating this quality, this capacity for sympathy. And it's a way of participating more deeply in, I would call, life. There's a deep combination of Neoplatonism and imaginal practice applied, in this case, to nature. And so the idea would be that this is a way, that there is a way here to develop the cognitive function of sympathy. And Cheetham, through Corbin, feels that this is necessary for the elevation of the soul to a mode of being that transcends the literalisms and dogmas in which we're so easily entrapped and entangled. I would talk about a reciprocal feedback loop between the development of the soul and the development of this, I would say, mode of perception or mode of being. Quote, it is only through such sympathy that we can recognize, quote, the angelic function of a being. Quote, the angelic function of the angel's mediation. Okay, so gosh, there's a way, it's a little hard to understand this. I think I would sort of connect that each living thing is in a way striving for something. In a way, each living form is aspiring, is growing and developing. The idea being that one way of understanding that is that each being has a sort of material and visible and lower, and also immaterial or invisible and higher aspect, the higher of which is conceived as an angel or divine double. And so there's a way of not only recognizing this in ourselves as amnesis, remembering that about ourselves or as ourselves, as who we are, but also recognizing that in life, in nature. And this is what he means by the angelic function of beings. So it seems that there's a way that what he calls the angel or angels, they mediate. They, in a way, we could say that they somehow mediate between, again, the sort of lower material forms could call and the one. So the intermediary layer is the layer of souls, or otherwise conceived of as angels. So that's helping you to understand what is meant by the imaginal world. It's a mode of perception where that stuff becomes sort of available or obvious to perception, which is just really another way of looking at everything, right? It's just another, it's in a way, it's an overlay, like a different pair of glasses, but it's not quite as far off as we maybe would think that it would be. Cheetham continued, again, it's only through such sympathy that we can recognize the angelic function of a being, the angelic function of the angel's mediation. It is this function of the angel acting through sensible things and of beings so experienced, quote, which makes possible a life in sympathy with beings. Capable of giving a transcendent dimension to their being, to their beauty, to the forms of their faith. Okay, so that's quite interesting. So there's a way that what he's saying is that, quote unquote, the angel, or what I understand to be our divine double, right? It has not only a role in our sort of interior, in the development of our own interiority, our own aspiration, our own spiritual development, but it has other, you could call functions or capacities that have to do with making possible this kind of sympathy with beings. And so, in a way, it's sort of, I mean, it's talking about sympathy rather than empathy, but in a way, it's sort of like a deeper form of empathic recognition. So there's a way of the angel itself or the divine double, it mediates. It has a mediating function or quality. So there's a way that when we cultivate that relationship, we're also cultivating, you could sort of say, access to this perspective that is from out of that divine double. And this makes possible, quote, a life in sympathy with beings. That he says, quote, capable of giving a transcendent dimension to their being. And so the question that I would have there would be about, is this simply a sort of way of recognizing what other beings are already doing and therefore sort of caring better for them as a result of that recognition? Or is it the case that in some way that recognition or that sympathy with beings uh, has an affording quality, that it affords something for those beings, which is really a question about human consciousness. What is the role of human consciousness? What is the purpose, or in this way, the function in relation to nature of such recognition, of such sympathy? Is it just a quality of recognition, sort of as we normally conceive it, or is something else going on there? Because he said, again, that the angel or divine double makes possible, quote, a life in sympathy with beings, capable of giving a transcendent dimension to their being, to their beauty, to the forms of their faith. So this is it's a kind of a developmental variant of the question of whether a tree falls in the wood if there's no one there to hear it. The idea being that do things develop toward the one unless if we don't recognize that? The implication being no, they don't, and that there is something that our own consciousness is doing. So to me, this is a very deeply alchemical idea, right? And so there's a way that by facilitating, I would say, the development of this form of sympathy, we can come to, in a way, recognize and allow for the fulfillment of, in a way, the purpose which is inherent within nature, and in some way realize the form that is the faith of nature, the forms of faith that exist in nature. The idea being that nature has faith in us as humans by giving rise to us. And we can honor that faith by sort of developing this kind of sympathy and honoring it. And that would look like it practically, and not only practically. So the idea is that, again, that this recognition, that this sympathy actually affords something for nature, that there is a deep developmental feedback loop between human and nature. And again, presence and place, 3 and 4, it's the same thing. And talking about this sympathy is focusing on the betweenness. It's focusing on the developmental. It's not just the developmental. It's like it's this between space again. It's coming up again. Well, what does it mean? It's like it's a space of affordance. It's a Why is it about affordance? I don't know, but it is. It's really hard to nail this. It's that kind of thing. I think it's not something that can be defined. It's actually a different form of language. But that's too far afield, so I have to steer back toward the text. Yeah, this is actually really, really profound. It's like, wow. Again, the idea that there's sort of intention or aspiration that is inherent within nature, that is locked or trapped within nature, and that she is waiting for us to recognize that, to have sympathy with and for that. And it's through the development of the relationship with the divine double that this becomes possible, that this is becomes available, and that as a result, the purpose that is inherent within nature you could say is able to be fulfilled, but the risk is the anthropomorphism. The risk, and I think the right answer there is that we don't yet know. We don't yet know how important exactly the presence of this sympathetic consciousness is. The idea being it might be really, really critically, crucially important, which is the whole point of sort of alchemy, right? And you'd have to be really careful about that because it wouldn't be we're talking about this sort of self-generating feedback loop between the human and the natural. And when if we talk about that properly, then anthropomorphism is not the proper language for it. What I mean is that the philosophy that humans are top of the food chain and humans are the best, that's not what I'm talking about. But it might be true, nevertheless, that human consciousness has a crucial role to play in the fulfillment of the purpose of nature, obviously. Quote, a spiritual life is not, therefore, a life turned away from this world. Rather, it is only through this world that such a life can be lived. That's the same idea again. It's through the exoteric to the esoteric. The only way toward transcendence is by common union, communion with nature, with this world. And this isn't a nature mysticism either. It's it's a process of self-recognition and nature recognition that are going together. So there are ways that this is deeply not at all consonant with modern environmentalism and ecology. This is actually something that's quite different than that. Now I get a quote from Suhrawardi, who says, the sensible species does not divert from the angel, but leads to the place of the encounter, on the condition that the soul seeks the encounter. The sensible species does not divert from the angel, but leads to the place of the encounter, on the condition that the soul seeks the encounter. For there are various ways of turning toward the sensible. There is one that simultaneously and as such turns toward the angel. What follows is the transmutation of the sensible into symbols. Okay, so what I pick up through this quote from Suhrawardi is that there's a way of sort of simultaneously and in sort of reciprocal feedback, cultivating an awareness of both the divine double and, in a way, the angelic aspect of beings. And that's really like it's so like that's already so far out, right? But it's like I think it's not true that one has to develop a sort of exclusive relationship with this divine double in order to develop this sympathy with beings, but that it's also the other way. So there's a reciprocal dynamic going on where if we can learn to quote unquote turn toward the sensible in both senses of the word in this way, then we not only become more aware of things and of particularly living things, but also all things, but also develop this relationship with our own quote unquote divine double. So it's both. And that's also a turn toward seeing things in symbolic terms. That's the same. It's the same turn. And it's also a turn toward theophany. It's a turn toward encounter. It's a turn toward visionary perception. But there should be understood to be important, so to speak, practical outcomes of that. Like this involves a very different way of relating to self, to nature, to the world, and so on. Might have to keep going here. So Cheetham continues. In one of the most vital passages in his book on Ibn Arabi, Corbin tells us that the primary importance of is that it protects us against idolatry. So basically, something that actually doesn't make sense as a sentence, but something going on here is protecting us against idolatry, which is quite interesting. So let's try and understand what Corbin means. What exactly is protecting us from idolatry? Corbin states, talking about idolatry, he says, that two-faced spiritual infirmity, which consists in either loving an object without transcendence or in misunderstanding that transcendence by separating it from the loved object, through which alone it is manifested. These two aspects spring from the same cause. In both cases, a man becomes incapable of the sympathy, which gives beings and forms their transcendent dimension. Again, okay, so it's just the same sort of thing. It's like either we tend towards sort of idolizing the transcendent at the expense of the immanent, or we idolize the immanent without any transcendence. And these are both idolatrous mistakes. And Corbin is talking about this sympathy with beings as a way to defend against that idolatry. And he, yeah, so again, he says that this kind of sympathy that we can be capable of quote, gives beings and forms their transcendent dimension. And I'm I can't evaluate that claim yet. I'm not sure about that claim. I'm willing to agree that there's probably something that human consciousness is doing, but it might also just be about recognizing the transcendent dimension which is already there, right? So I think there are mistakes either side that can come very easily from either um, overestimating or misrecognizing the significance of our own quote unquote sympathetic presence. But there are also mistakes that come from not overestimating but underestimating the significance of that presence. So is it true that this mode of perception gives beings and forms their transcendent dimension? How could that claim be verified? That is a good question. I think it is. So I might keep going here. So Cheetham continues. Actually, I might just try to summarize from there. So it was sort of talking about the sort of imaginally inspired philosophy of nature. So we're sort of talking about, yeah, again, if we have McGilchrist, we have sort of this wisdom school stuff applied to our relationship with ourselves, with nature, with other people, and with the sacred. And that's actually all going together here through imaginal practice in the context of both individual work and group work, aspirational development, and so on. We have this sort of philosophy of nature that comes through Proclus, Corbin, Ibn Arabi, and so on. It's talking about yeah, it's cultivating different capacities for perception. So it's cultivating not only certain kinds of inner awareness of our own quote unquote divine double, or we could talk about modes of the soul or states of the soul, like which is just like there are Jungian versions of that same kind of thing, right? And this is connected deeply with the way that we're perceiving and relating with nature. And so that can be taken directly into different kinds of practice. So the idea that again, dialogical and imaginal practices can be in a way focused toward or on certain forms, and this can be deeply affording of different kinds of reciprocity, different kinds of resonance that involve a combination of not only epistemology and ontology, but sort of mutual participation, mutual sympathy, shared aspiration, deeper presence, deeper dwelling, deeper wisdom. Yeah, capacity to sort of facilitate the development of the soul of the world just as much as our own souls. What else? Yeah, and then we can sort of getting these again. This is sort of languaged in terms of these different feedback reciprocal feedback dynamics between visible and invisible. Sort of, yeah, the intellect or the celestial, heavenly, and the earthly or the material. What else? Again, deeply involving action and passion and recognition of these qualities. Deeply involving, yeah, recognition of the imaginal and the angelic function of beings as a sort of intermediary layer. Deeply involving a role for our sort of active presence, our human consciousness, or you could say the consciousness of the soul. Anything more? Yeah, there's a deep relationship with place, obviously, that we've been talking about. It's about this is cultivating deeper participation and deeper dwelling, deeper rootedness in place, but also deeper transcendence at the same time. So it's a feedback loop between them, getting them going together in opponent processing, reciprocal opening, which is the same as a spiritual life. This is, I mean, obviously, through all of this. Yep, defense against idolatry in different ways. And that's fine. That's pretty much all of what's been talked about so far, I think. It was already a lot, right? Again, no, nature can only be understood in the context of creation as a whole. So there's a way that we can recognize nature more deeply, perceive nature more deeply, cultivate different modes of presence, modes of the soul. But it's also about seeing the whole, seeing the one, and the essential community between, I would say, all things. Okay, and now, well, we had a quote from Corbin on idolatry, and now Cheetham continues. It is sympathy that is the prerequisite of tawil. So again, tawil was this sort of reading the word in things in a way. It's like as if like reading nature, reading what's going on, like the Quran or like the Bible, like as if what's happening is prophetic, um, or yeah, reading what's going on as if it were a sacred text, in the sense that it is a sacred text in a way. So they were talking about the word, the divine word, and God as creator, writing this deep language that's present in what's happening as it's happening, and that tawil is this sort of practice of recognizing that and practicing sacred reading in this way that is a means toward gnosis, towards ascension, and towards spirit, toward transcendence. Okay, and so this kind of sympathy is a prerequisite for that. That's an interesting idea. Okay, so I'm still going to continue because I can't really stop halfway through this stuff because it takes too long to get back into it, right? Because there's been so much talked about already. So Cheetham continues. Again, it's the sympathy, it's this kind of sympathy that we've been talking about that is the prerequisite for tawil. Likewise, in the hermeneutics of Hugh of St. Victor, quote, study means something like sympathy. So to study something is to be in sympathy with it in a way. That makes sense. Although he says it is the ability to open oneself to the presence of things and of persons. So again, there's an orientation to presence and to personhood, and to persons themselves that has, it's in a way both creative and receptive dimensions. So we can receive the presence of things and of persons more deeply. And this, I would say, goes along with the conferral of personhood in agapic terms, I would say. Quote, the inability to experience such sympathy may come from two sources. On the one hand, it may come from a fear of the infinite vastness of reality and the powerlessness of the ego to dominate and control it. Okay, so that's obviously definitely true. We would need to ask, okay, what's the other fear? They're probably going to talk about that. And he does. He talks about pious asceticism or Puritanism later on. But again, this first one, which is about fear, okay, this fear of the infinite vastness of reality, that's definitely the case. And so we would need to Can we be upfront about that? Can we talk about that fear? Can we bring that into view? Can we relate with that fear and our powerlessness? So we would need to, obviously we could consider that to be something traumatic. So that's quite interesting. It's a sort of in the same way that Groff has sort of talked about this birth traumas that go sort of inherently along with the human condition, right? Just by being born, we're stuck with some traumas. Well, this is a kind of existential version of that anyway. It's like that I mean, Groff would talk about that in terms of BPM 2. Not that I should, it's too far afield to talk about that, but it's basically the no exit situation. It's in birth terms, it's the sense of being stuck in the womb when the cervix hasn't opened, but the contractions have begun. It's like, oh shit, I'm small and powerless, and I'm contained and trapped, and I can't go anywhere. It's the same kind of feeling. And so, yeah, so that's quite interesting. The idea being that unless if we can process that fear a bit more, like if we can relate with that fear and be in that fear and feel that fear more, that that what goes along with that is the capacity to experience this kind of sympathy with things, with persons. Okay, so that's quite interesting. The idea that yeah, that definitely makes sense to me, right? There's a kind of inverse relationship between our stuckness, our atomization, our being trapped, our being confined, like Rilke's panther, when we're cut off, again, disconnected from the world. This is to me going along with fear of the infinite vastness of reality. Why? Because that kind of containment is both, there's something about it is self-induced. It's a self-protection mechanism, partly. Like the fear of wide open spaces, for example. It's that kind of thing. Yeah, and so working with a lot of that is really required in order to unlock a reciprocal feedback between processing our own deep existential emotions about our sort of existential situation, and what it feels like to actually live as the small, let's say, quote unquote, ego and our powerlessness as such, but also that we can cultivate relationality, that we can cultivate this kind of sympathy, that we can cultivate capacity for transcendence. I think we can see there how gnosis is a spiritual resource, right? So resourcing through spirituality. Again, this is like for me as a, let's say, as a breathwork facilitator, this is part and parcel of what I work with, right? This is like the profound states that we can enter into just by breathing, right? They act actually as a resource, as an inner resource, that we can cultivate such resources actively and experientially, and that they can help us to then titrate our existential fears and the sense of powerlessness. And obviously that this, yeah, so here gnosis and transcendence are conceived as resourcing, experiential resourcing. And we understand that that has a key role in helping us, again, to titrate the deeper wells of existential fear. And that with that kind of a feedback loop, well, we can unlock deeper relationality, deeper sympathy, deeper experiential intimacy, and deep forms of self-realization, both within ourselves and within nature. Alignment between self and nature. So that instead of being powerlessness and stuck and needing to dominate and control, we can recognize the insecurity and the fear that that derives from and work with that instead. So we see how much work is involved in this. I mean, wow, right? Okay, we now get a quote from Corbin who says, the cause, again, so we were talking about the inability to experience this sympathy that we've been discussing, and we've been talking about one of those, which is this quote, it may come from a fear of the infinite vastness of reality and the powerlessness of the ego to dominate and control it. Um, yeah, so, and I talked about that with reference to Groff, in reference to birth trauma, the sense of containment, being stuck and trapped, as well as this fear, as a kind of self-protection. but although I'm not reducing it to that. And then we get this quote from Corbin about that, and then we talk about the other way in which this kind of sympathy is something that we can't experience. So on this fear of the infinite vastness of reality and powerlessness of the ego to dominate and control it, Corbin says, the cause may be a will to power, dogmatic or otherwise, which wishes to immobilize beings and forms at the point where man has immobilized himself. Perhaps out of us, that's fascinating. I'll finish the quote. Again, it said, the cause may be a will to power, dogmatic or otherwise, which wishes to immobilize beings and forms at the point where man has immobilized himself, perhaps out of a secret fear of the infinite successions of perpetual transcendences, and the knowledge that to be faithful to the angel is precisely to let ourselves be guided by him toward towards the transcendences that he announces. Wow, there's so much in there. So I have to draw some of it out. So the idea is that yes, we have a will to power, which is kind of this anthropocentrism, deeply Nietzschean in a sense, uh, motivation that goes along with, I don't know, the kind of being that we're experiencing at this time. And so this can be dogmatic or not. And so there's a sense that we have that this, again, we have this sort of deep existential fear of the vastness of reality and the concomitant powerlessness, right? That goes a lot, that's a different feeling than the fear. And I would say that the need for dominance and control comes in reaction to both of those, right? It's from the insecurity, and that insecurity that in a way we are in fact powerless. Um, in a way that is a misrecognition because although it's true that there's a sense in which we are powerless, there are also other ways in which we're deeply powerful. And so there's a way that the powerlessness that we sense itself is illusory, although it's definitely also deeply true and real. And so it would seem to me that the fear of the infinite vastness of reality is re is in a way a reaction to that sense of powerlessness. And it seems to me that the dominance and control of nature and of reality that we try to exercise is a reaction to that. Again, is a response or an actualization of that fear. Okay, and so then if that would be the case, yeah, so that's kind of the diagnosing the will to power in a way. And then there's more there that's going on, right? So the implication is that the result of that will to power derived from, yeah, the need to dominate and control stemming from fear, and underlying fear derived from insecurity about our powerlessness, which I said was partly, but not entirely, illusory. And so the result is this control and dominance, right? And the quote unquote the wish to immobilize beings and forms. So there's something that is an at the point where man has immobilized himself. So there's a couple of things about that. One of them is that's an exaptation of predation circuitry. So when a predator wants to eat its prey, right, catch it, it has to catch it, which involves immobilization, stopping it, getting it, containing it. Look. I mean, look. That's like animal husbandry, like goat herding, as the origin of the agrarian revolution. That's the same thing, containing it, right? And then not only is that an exaptation of predatory circuitry, so it's like, oh, that's a game theory which is so deep, right? Look at that, look, because what I'm saying is that's the philosophy of I have to eat you before you eat me. I have to eat you before you eat me. So we're talking about the existential origins of predation. I have to get you before you get me. I have to do it first so that before you do it. Wow. And so and we see how like that's the arms race dynamic, right? Is what I'm saying. Right? That's the US and China, the tragedy of the commons. That the race to the deployment of new technologies. That's Elon and Sam Altman and so on. It's the same dynamic. So we're seeing how that game theory trap is itself an exaptation of these kinds of insecurities. The root of it is a inability to coordinate, inability to recognize that there are shared interests that are in common, and an inability to think outside. It's a deeply egoic uh, impulsivity, and fear-based sort of scarcity mentality because it comes from narrow-mindedly having to care about just oneself rather than the whole, rather than all. And so what I'm getting here, and like, wow, this is so much, right? But that's incredible, is that so again, through Daniel trying to diagnose the game theory stuff is sort of deep to the meta crisis, right? And so what's at the root of that? And then he's like finding these coordination solutions is the solution, essentially, and why we do like international laws and treaties, and a quick example is the national park. We say, hey, you can't come and cut this down to earn money from the wood because we all want a national park. That's an example at a local scale of binding a multipolar trap. Okay, so we have the further insight that there's a couple of things there. I have to be thorough here. So what I'm saying is that in a way that kind of response is a top-down laws, rules, and regulations kind of response, right? But and um there's a way that is relying on language. It's relying on the law of the land. It's relying on shared agreement fields. Um, and it's also relying on rule of law, meaning some guy has a big stick and he's going to come and whack you with it. And look, humans also worked out how to, like before we had that, we also worked out how to bind the multipolar trap problem with wisdom, with indigenous wisdom involving restraint. This is from the Human Origins playlist. There's a deep, again, a feedback loop between the human and the natural, between nature and our care for nature. So what am I really saying here about that? Well, it's really tricky. There's something here where there's a more bottom-up emergent solution to regulating our exploitation of nature that humans learned how to do. And we learned how to do that bottom-up emergent solution before, meaning prior to how we, prior to when we learned how to turn that into laws and rules and regulations. So I'm saying that those laws and rules and regulations that we see in the form of international treaties, they are derivative of a deeper process. And I'm trying to talk about what that deeper process is. So what we were seeing earlier is that the predation prey circuitry is built right into nature, right? We see that everywhere. And similarly, again, from the Human Origins playlist, there are these dichotomies, not only of predator and prey, but also same species and different species, male and female, toxic and non-toxic. Um, plant and animal. That's a not as good of a one, but lots of these, right? And A different one would be sort of inhibition and approach, meaning stop or go, or also away from or toward. It's more neuroscientific. And then, so the idea would be that humans worked out how to see things in multiple ways. So we humans worked out culture. Humans worked out how to transcend these built-in dichotomies, at least a bit. And so another way of talking about everything that we've been discussing so far is getting back to that, getting back to the core of human culture. And I talked about that explicitly in that playlist. This is where the core of human culture can be understood to be cultivating a bottom-up capacity for solving multipolar traps through recognition, through deeper recognition, and it's mutual recognition. We could say between all beings, but it's just a bit cheap. It's like between human and nature, essentially. Okay, now I have to steer back toward the quote, and then I would probably have to stop. Okay, so what I want to say is that until and unless we process our existential fears, then we get stuck in this will to power. So the will to power and dominance and control by the ego is a fallen cultural form. So there have to be egos before that comes about, is first of all, and that's already a symptom of being cut off from gnosis in the way that we've been talking about. The fact that there are egos, I mean. But then we also have this, the response is an exaptation and a kind of parasitism on the predation prey circuitry, where we feel the need to immobilize beings and forms at the point where man has immobilized himself. And that comes with a couple of different motivations. It's a twisting of the predation prey circuitry. It's also something else. It's also not only the need to use that circuitry by containing, by immobilizing beings and forms, but it's quote at the point where man has immobilized himself. Well, why would that be? It's not. It's also from a need to see ourselves as equal in some way, rather than like imagine if some of those quote unquote beings and forms could become more than we are. Well, we wouldn't be able to feel that we're the best, and we would be afraid. We'd be afraid to be eaten, and so that's why it's a multipolar trap thing. Is it's like I'm gonna eat you, and not only that, but I'm gonna stop you from transcending. I'm gonna stop you from evolving and growing and aspiring, so because I'm afraid that you'll eat me. So it's a deep mistrust. It's a deep mistrust of nature. And there might be fair enough. There might be reason for that, right? Because it might be true. I mean, most species last about 1 million years. Humans haven't lasted that long. So quote unquote, that this that this immobilization, this will to power doesn't just come from the need to dominate and control. It's not just about putting oneself higher, or at least equal. It's also about stopping whatever is other from becoming more, from becoming higher. It's not only about wanting to be at the top, it's about not wanting to be at the bottom. And that comes apparently from a kind of inner paralysis, again, wanting to immobilize beings and forms at the point where man has immobilized himself. The idea being that we're not only afraid of what other quote unquote beings and forms are, but we're actually afraid of ourselves. We're afraid to see, to recognize, and to realize who we are. Hence, we've immobilized ourselves. Hence, we immobilize the world. Hence, we contain our vision and reduce ourselves, quote unquote, perhaps out of a secret fear of the infinite successions of perpetual transcendences. Yep. So it's not only the fear of the transcendence, it's about the the infinity of that, right? It's about it's the fear of the infinite, essentially, and it's a fear of change also. And the knowledge that to be faithful to the angel is precisely to let ourselves be guided by him toward the transcendences that he announces. Yeah, I mean, so it's easy to say, oh, we just have to have faith. But the point is, uh, we actually we feel all of that stuff that we were just talking about, and we don't know that we do because it's all unconscious. So maybe a little bit of it is conscious. But the idea is that again, through Groff and Jung and others, is like there is a collective unconscious. It is deep and it has deep wells, and we've been talking about some of them because this one of the deepest insights is that the game theory dynamic, the multipolar trap problem, goes all the way back down into predator and prey, and how that, especially in creatures that can be both predator or prey, right, as humans can, um, the idea, the notion that we could find a way of being that suits everyone, right, that we don't have to keep eating and being eaten. This is deeply, in a way, unnatural. And in a way, it really does require faith in the sense that, well, humans kind of worked out a few steps of the way toward that through the invention of culture, the advent of humanity, I would say, what we consider Homo sapiens sapiens. And in a way, that does come with the existence of transcendence, right? It's like there's a way that transcending the logic of game theory requires transcendence itself, because we have to get out of the temptation of predation. And that requires processing requires being with all of this, the powerlessness and the fear that's derivative from it, and the egos themselves, the dominance and the control that they tend toward, the fear of change, the fear of the infinite, shadow work. I mean, this is the depths here, because these are really deep, 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 deep and ancient fears that we don't even notice that we're perpetuating, which is ironic because we're perpetuating it, right? So, I mean, what could come out of that is it could appear to be pessimistic in the sense that if we see that this sort of predator prey stuff is sort of built into nature, but I don't think it has to be pessimistic because we can see how human culture, properly conceived, is designed to work against it, to work against that, or you could say, I wouldn't put it in confrontational terms. I would say there could be ways that could be conceived of participating in quote unquote natural dynamics that we probably can't avoid without letting them consume us, without letting them possess us. So I wouldn't want to reduce predator prey dynamics to game theory. We can see how predator prey dynamics are themselves taken up into the larger functioning of ecosystems in nature. But we can see that if we don't work with that programming within ourselves, then it gets captured, it gets turned into a response, a deeply natural, built-in response to our fear, which is itself natural. So all this stuff is about disentangling through, yeah, it's about creating a space of presence, creating a space of mutual recognition and connection, and then using that itself as a resource in a, it's like a, there's a name for that. It's like a, it's not only a launch pad, it's more like a, when you're mountain climbing and you put a, and you put a spike in the rock, and then because you put that there for the first time, right? There wasn't a spike before, so you discovered something, you made something new. It's a place, or like, and then you can rely on that place to heal yourself or climb further up the mountain. Both. And I'll have to, I mean, look, I have to stop now because this is just became a lot, right? Didn't it? So I'll leave this here and I'll return to sort of halfway through this section in a minute. Could I summarize any more? I probably ought to. I would simply say, yeah, I mean, we were talking about sympathy. We were talking about the way that intentional practice through imaginal work is applied to nature, is applied to the development of the soul as well as the development of the soul of nature, the soul of the world, through the work of Proclus, Corbin, Ibn Arabi, Suhrawardi. And then, yeah, so that was basically, it was stuff about Neoplatonism, nature, and the one, aspirational development in co-evolution with nature as a new way of reconceiving of who we are and what we're doing here. Protection against idolatry, lots of stuff about cultivating different opponent processing dynamics, but then also, yeah, that kind of sympathy that we get as a result of that, as a prerequisite of the tawil that he's talking about through Sufism. And then, yeah, then we talk about that sympathy as a capacity to open oneself to the presence of things and persons, to receptive and creative dynamics, I would say. And finally, why we can't do that. And it's because of all of these deep sources of existential fear and pain and so on. Yep. And so then we talked about gnosis and transcendence as spiritual resourcing in that context. We were talking about fear, powerlessness, predation prey circuitry in relation to game theory dynamics, and the proper response to them being to cultivate the sense of wholeness, unity, oneness, and then to redeploy that internal resourcing to deep trauma work, and involving the game theory stuff response would be not only the sort of top-down legalism and international agreements and so on, that kind of thing, but it's also the recognition, like shared recognition, um, and of what nature is. And so the bottom-up response is the work of reensoulment. It's recognizing, I've talked about in that context, the 4E nature of the soul and 4E ensoulment in other contexts, but it's basically like recognizing that what the soul is embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. And when we do that, then we become conscious as the world. And if we can do that, then hopefully we can stop destroying ourselves quite so much. We can see how that self-consciousness can turn into self-destructiveness if we're not resourced properly. And so, yeah, it's the existential alienation of recognition of who we are. When we feel that loneliness, we feel that we've been abandoned, right? And it's the that loneliness is a well that's so deep. And so there's a way that we we destroy nature because we're destroying ourselves. It's a deep form of self-destructiveness. That's it's a kind of abortive tendency. And you might ask why it doesn't result in a tendency toward cancerous growth, because when cancer cells recognize their aloneness, then they grow in an uncontainable way. They don't self-destruct, although it does result in that. I'll have to leave that there as a curiosity. What would be important to understand at the end there would be that that kind of the self-recognition of ourselves as nature through 4E reensoulment could still result in self-destructiveness if we still feel alone as that. So that's why it's not just about the ensouled connection with nature, it's about connection with the transcendent. And there's a kind of triangle there. So that would be mother and father and son. I'll leave it at that.